On February the 3rd, 1942, approximately 100 miles off the Virginia coast near Norfolk, Lieutenant John Fitzgerald settled into the cockpit of a B-25B bomber marked with the designation 4-02261. The massive machine sat ready on the flight deck of the USS Hornet, a Navy aircraft carrier cutting through the Atlantic's dark swells. What struck Fitzgerald immediately was something remarkable. His airspeed indicator already showed 45 miles per hour, yet his engines hadn't even started. The reason was straightforward but extraordinary. The Hornet itself was moving forward through the water at considerable speed, transferring that velocity to anything sitting on its deck. This was the clever part of an impossible plan. The B-25 Mitchell beneath him was a beast. Fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, it weighed 27,000 pounds. Under normal circumstances, launching such an aircraft demanded a full runway, stretching at least 1,200 feet. But the Hornet's flight deck offered something far less generous, just 500 feet of available space before the bow dropped away to open water. Every aviation manual, every engineering calculation, every rational thought said this should fail catastrophically. Army bombers simply did not launch from Navy carrier decks. Engineers had argued that even craft weighing 15 tons couldn't achieve flight in such confined space. The laws of physics seemed immovable. Thrust-to-weight ratios, the basic principles of aerodynamics, everything pointed toward disaster. Yet Captain Francis Lowe had conceived this idea anyway, and General Henry Arnold had deemed it worth attempting. At 8:50 in the morning, Fitzgerald's two massive engines roared to full power. The sound was tremendous, a thunderous crescendo that thrummed through the airframe. He released the brakes and felt the aircraft lurch forward. Suddenly, 27,000 pounds of metal, fuel, and explosive ordnance began rolling down that narrow stretch of wooden deck. 500 feet stood between the bomber and either success or catastrophe. The open Atlantic waited below. In this moment, what happened next would reveal something Japan had fatally underestimated, precisely what America was capable of when driven to desperation. The physics of the situation had haunted planners for weeks. A B-25B Mitchell medium bomber, when fully loaded with fuel and ordnance, tipped the scales at exactly 27,000 pounds. Standard takeoff procedures in every Army Air Force manual stipulated a minimum of 1,200 feet of runway to achieve the necessary 90 miles per hour airspeed for liftoff. This wasn't arbitrary, it was physics. The USS Hornet's flight deck measured precisely 467 feet from the starting position to its bow, less than half the mandated distance. Not even close. By every conventional standard, what Captain Lowe was asking for represented mathematical impossibility. No one had ever successfully launched land-based bombers from Navy carrier decks. There was good reason for this. It shouldn't work. Lowe had first conceived the concept while observing carrier operations from the Norfolk Naval Air Station Tower in January 1942. He'd watched the choreography of naval aviation and recognized something others had missed. Twin-engine bombers possessed remarkable range. If they could somehow achieve takeoff from a carrier, they could strike distant targets no Army bomber had yet reached. The problem wasn't engine power or aerodynamic capability. It was purely mathematical. The intersection of distance available and acceleration required. The B-25's twin-right R2600 Cyclone engines generated 1,800 horsepower each. Adequate power existed. The limitation was straightforward: deck length and time. Accelerating 27,000 pounds to flying speed in just 467 feet seemed to defy every principle of flight. Lowe presented his calculations to Admiral Ernest King on January the 10th. King recognized the potential and forwarded the proposal to General Henry Arnold within 48 hours. Arnold made a decisive choice. He assigned the feasibility study to Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a man uniquely qualified for such an unconventional challenge. Doolittle possessed engineering credentials from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and extensive operational experience developing high-performance aircraft. He understood both the theory and the practical realities of flight. Doolittle's initial analysis confirmed what the mathematics suggested. Standard conditions made this impossible. But then he identified three variables that could alter the equation entirely. First, carrier deck movement itself could provide initial airspeed before the aircraft even started moving relative to the ship. Second, reducing aircraft weight through fuel and equipment modifications would improve the thrust-to-weight ratio dramatically. Third, headwind assistance from the carrier's forward motion would add additional airspeed at the critical moment of liftoff. The test flight on February 3rd would prove whether theoretical calculations matched reality. Fitzgerald had been selected specifically for this evaluation. His background included experience with short-field takeoffs during test pilot assignments at Wright Field. He was precisely the right pilot for this moment. The B-25B designated for the trial had undergone radical modification. All non-essential equipment had been stripped away, reducing gross weight to 25,000 pounds. Every pound mattered. The Hornet maintained exactly 25 knots of forward speed as Fitzgerald prepared, adding that velocity to the aircraft's acceleration before engine startup even began. He completed his pre-flight checklist at 8:45 in the morning. Both engines started normally and climbed to full power settings of 42 inches of manifold pressure. The sound was deafening. At 8:50, the deck crew removed the wheel chocks. The bomber surged forward with the carrier already providing 25 miles per hour of initial airspeed before the aircraft moved even a foot relative to the ship. The mathematics had begun their real-world test. The B-25 accelerated rapidly. Within 200 feet of deck movement, airspeed reached 60 miles per hour. The bomber was moving, but was it moving fast enough? At 300 feet, airspeed touched 75 miles per hour with just 167 feet of deck remaining. Fitzgerald gripped the control yoke tightly, every muscle focused. At 400 feet of deck travel, he applied full back pressure. The nose wheel lifted at 82 miles per hour. The landing gear was still down. The aircraft hadn't flown yet. Nearly at the edge now. The main gear cleared the deck edge at exactly 87 miles per hour with just 17 feet of runway remaining. A few seconds more and there would have been nothing but water. The bomber climbed away from the carrier, achieving normal flight characteristics within 30 seconds of leaving the deck. No difficulty, no emergency, just flight. The test continued for 47 minutes before Fitzgerald brought the B-25 back to Norfolk Army Air Base and touched down. Post-flight inspection revealed no structural damage, no abnormal engine parameters. Everything had worked. Arnold received Fitzgerald's flight report on February 4th. The implications were staggering. Within 24 hours, he approved development of a complete mission plan, utilizing carrier-launched bombers for long-range strikes against Japanese territory. The concept required extensive modifications to standard aircraft and specialized training for volunteer crews. But the fundamental feasibility had been established. This was no longer theory, this was proven capability. Doolittle received formal assignment as mission commander on February the 5th, with instructions to select and train volunteer air crews for an undisclosed target. The mission parameters were specific and demanding. 16 aircraft would launch from a single carrier at maximum fuel capacity for one-way flights to friendly territory after bombing runs. Each aircraft would carry approximately 1,000 gallons of fuel through installation of auxiliary tanks in bomb bay spaces where defensive armament normally sat. The successful test flight had eliminated the primary technical obstacle. Now came the execution. Standard military procurement procedures normally required additional testing phases, but Arnold authorized immediate progression to aircraft modification and crew training. The urgency wasn't born from technical concerns, it came from strategic necessity. Japanese territorial expansion continued relentlessly throughout the Pacific, while American forces remained limited to defensive operations from existing bases, thousands of miles away from enemy home islands. Something needed to change. Something needed to strike back. On February the 10th, 24 B-25B bombers entered modification at Mid-Continent Airlines facilities in Minneapolis. The conversion process was thorough and complete. The Bendix turret installations came off. Radio equipment weight reduced by 230 pounds. Supplementary fuel tanks were installed, increasing total capacity from 646 gallons to 141 gallons. The gunner positions were retained to maintain aircraft balance, but the defensive armament was replaced with wooden replicas to preserve weight distribution while reducing actual firepower. This was a bomber designed purely for one mission. On March 3, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle assembled 140 volunteer airmen from the 17th Bombardment Group at Eglin Field, Florida. These men had responded to requests for volunteers for an extremely hazardous mission. They knew nothing of targets, duration, or operational parameters. Doolittle's briefing contained no specifics regarding destination or enemy forces. Security classifications prevented disclosure of carrier launch procedures, flight distances, or landing arrangements. The volunteers knew only that something significant was being asked of them. These were experienced medium bomber crews with considerable operational time in B-25 Mitchell aircraft. Average flight experience exceeded 800 hours per pilot, with combat training completed at southeastern training bases during late 1941. They represented skilled professionals, not rookies. Pilot experience, navigator capability, bombardier accuracy, all of it was present. Crew positions included pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners selected from units scheduled for Pacific Theater deployment. Yet none possessed carrier aviation experience. None had operational background in naval operations. Doolittle's next statement was crucial. Any individual could withdraw from the program without prejudice or official record. The mission requirements included extended overwater navigation, low-altitude bombing runs against defended targets, and landing at unfamiliar airfields under potentially hostile conditions. Training would commence immediately with no leave time authorized until mission completion. Security classification required complete isolation from personnel not directly involved. No airman requested removal. Every single volunteer remained committed. The group proceeded to quarters assignments and initial briefings on modified aircraft systems. Training schedules allocated 6 weeks for specialized procedures not covered in standard Army Air Force curricula. It was a compressed timeline reflecting operational urgency rather than the adequate preparation periods normally required for such extensive retraining. On March 5th, Lieutenant Henry Miller arrived from Naval Air Station Pensacola to conduct carrier takeoff instruction. His background included 3 years of carrier aviation experience aboard USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown, with qualifications in F-4F Wildcat and SPD Dauntless aircraft. His assignment represented the first formal cooperation between Army and Navy aviation units for joint operational training. The primary challenge was teaching Army bomber pilots to execute takeoffs in distances 1/3 shorter than standard runway requirements. Miller established a training course using white lines painted on Eglin Field's main runway to simulate carrier deck dimensions. The marked area measured exactly 467 feet in length, with additional lines indicating the position of a carrier's island superstructure. Pilots practiced maintaining precise alignment while achieving maximum acceleration within the constrained space. The initial attempts required an average of 650 feet for successful takeoffs. They were failing. They had to improve. The training program focused on specific techniques that Miller taught methodically. Full power application before brake release, precise rudder control maintained centerline tracking, optimal rotation speed timing to achieve liftoff at minimum airspeed. Each pilot completed 50 practice takeoffs during the first week of training. Performance improvements occurred rapidly as crews adapted to the compressed takeoff procedures. By March 15th, all pilots consistently achieved takeoffs within 450 feet of ground roll. Lieutenant Donald Smith established a program record with a takeoff distance of just 287 feet, a performance that exceeded requirements by significant margins. The achievement demonstrated that adequately trained Army pilots could execute carrier launch procedures despite lacking naval aviation background. The technique was learnable. It wasn't magic, it was skill. Navigation training addressed the unique requirements of long-range over-water flights without radio navigation aids. Lieutenant Henry Potter, assigned as lead navigator, conducted instruction in dead reckoning techniques using celestial observations and compass headings. The training scenarios assumed radio silence throughout the mission, with no ground-based navigation assistance available after carrier departure. Darkness and clouds posed constant threats to navigation accuracy. Weather analysis became a critical component of navigation planning since cloud cover could eliminate celestial navigation options during extended overwater segments. Potter's instruction emphasized backup navigation methods, including wind drift calculations and fuel consumption monitoring, to maintain course accuracy when visual references were unavailable. Each navigator practiced plotting courses for flights exceeding 12 hours duration over open ocean. The margin for error was zero. Bombing accuracy training utilized ranges at Eglin Field and nearby Choctawhatchee Bay for simulated attacks against industrial targets. The modified B-25 aircraft carried reduced bomb loads due to additional fuel tank installations, limiting each aircraft to approximately 500 pounds of bombs or equivalent in secondary loads. Bombardier training focused on low-altitude attacks from 1,500 feet altitude to ensure target accuracy while maintaining aircraft survivability. Precision mattered absolutely. The aircraft modifications created significant changes in flight characteristics that required extensive pilot familiarization. Removal of the Bendix turret altered the aircraft's center of gravity, affecting control responses during takeoff and landing phases. Additional fuel tanks in the bomb bay and other compartments increased gross weight to maximum design limits, reducing climb performance and maneuverability compared to standard B-25 configurations. These weren't standard bombers anymore. They were specialized machines requiring unique piloting techniques. Engine management became critical due to extended range requirements and maximum fuel loads. Training emphasized fuel conservation techniques, including optimal power settings for maximum range cruise flight. The Wright R2600 engines consumed approximately 150 gallons per hour at normal cruise power, requiring precise fuel management to achieve the mission's range objectives with minimal reserves upon arrival at destination airfields. Every gallon was precious. Miscalculation meant ditching in the ocean. Ground maintenance training covered emergency repair procedures and basic troubleshooting for mechanical problems that might develop during the mission. Each crew received instruction in field maintenance techniques since normal ground support would be unavailable at destination airfields. The training included engine oil system servicing, fuel system repairs, and basic electrical troubleshooting procedures that flight crews could perform without specialized equipment. Self-sufficiency was essential. By March 31st, all volunteer crews had completed the specialized training curriculum and demonstrated proficiency in carrier takeoff procedures, extended range navigation, and low-altitude bombing techniques. The training phase concluded with full mission rehearsals using actual flight profiles and bomb loads planned for operational employment. Everyone was ready. The preparation was complete. On April 2, 1942, Task Force 16 departed San Francisco Bay with 16 B-25B Mitchell bombers secured to the flight deck of USS Hornet. The naval formation was substantial and purposeful. The aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, 4 cruisers, USS Salt Lake City, USS Northampton, USS Minneapolis, and USS Nashville. 8 destroyers and 2 fleet oilers completed the task force. Vice Admiral William Halsey commanded from Enterprise with orders to approach within 400 nautical miles of the Japanese coast for bomber launch operations. The B-25 aircraft occupied the entire forward section of Hornet's flight deck, with wings folded over the deck edges to maximize space utilization. Traditional carrier aircraft operations became impossible with the Army bombers in position, eliminating the ship's defensive fighter capability during the approach to enemy territory. The task force relied entirely on escort vessels and long-range patrol aircraft for protection against Japanese naval and air forces. It was a calculated risk. Weather conditions during the Pacific crossing included frequent rain squalls and seas reaching 8 to 12 feet in height. The Hornet pitched and rolled through the heavy waters, the secured bombers straining against their moorings. Every man aboard understood they were approaching Japanese-controlled waters. Every mile brought them closer to conflict. The violent ocean heaved against the ship's hull, putting tremendous stress on everything used to tie down the aircraft. The maintenance crews worked constantly, checking and rechecking the cables and shock absorbers that held the bombers in place. Several B-25s took hits from the rough deck movement, cracked panels on their wings, inspection covers torn loose, but the mechanics worked through the voyage to patch them up. Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle would fly the first bomber out. Everything was set for takeoff on April 19th at 6 in the morning, launching from a spot roughly 450 nautical miles east of Tokyo Bay. The plan was straightforward in theory. Each pilot would navigate solo to his assigned target, drop his bombs, then push on toward friendly airfields deep inside unoccupied China. The whole journey from carrier to Chinese runways stretched nearly 2,400 nautical miles, a brutal 14 hours of flying at cruising power. Back on the Enterprise, radio operators listened carefully to every Japanese communication they could intercept as the task force crept closer. Intelligence officers studied the patterns and saw nothing alarming. The Japanese were flying their normal patrol routes, nothing unusual. Their patrol planes typically ranged out about 600 nautical miles from their home islands, following the same paths they always did. The task force was still outside that patrol zone, or so they thought. Then at 7:38 in the morning, on April 18th, someone on the Hornet's bridge spotted it, a small speck on the water way out on the horizon. Northeast, bearing 90 degrees, roughly 12,000 yards away. As they got a better look, they identified it as the Nito Maru No. 23, a converted fishing boat, only 70 tons but equipped for patrol duty. The Japanese crew saw the American ships immediately. Radio operators aboard that tiny vessel began transmitting urgent signals toward Tokyo, telling everyone that American naval forces had been found. The USS Nashville didn't hesitate. At 7:42 hours, her 6-inch guns roared to life, firing across 9,000 yards of open ocean toward the patrol boat. The Japanese vessel tried to dodge, but kept transmitting, kept calling for help. 9 minutes of naval gunfire tore into that small boat. F-4F Wildcat fighters from the Enterprise raked it with machine gun fire. When the smoke cleared, the patrol boat was gone, sunk, no survivors. But there was a problem. Multiple Japanese shore stations had intercepted those radio messages before the boat went down. By the time the Nito Maru No. 23 hit bottom, Tokyo knew. They knew 3 large American warships were out there, roughly 650 nautical miles to the east. Within minutes, Japanese naval headquarters would be plotting where those ships were headed, getting ready to send everything they had. Vice Admiral Halsey faced a choice. He could stick to the original plan and keep moving closer, or launch right now. He made his decision, launch immediately. But that choice had teeth. Launching 170 nautical miles short meant every bomber had to fly an extra 170 miles. Every plane would have less daylight when they reached China. The fuel calculations had already been tight. Now they were becoming desperate. Any headwind, any navigation mistake, and planes would be dropping into the ocean. The weather wasn't helping. 40-knot winds whipped across the flight deck from the northeast. 8-foot swells rolled beneath the carrier, with some waves climbing to 12 feet. Rain squalls reduced visibility to 3 or 5 miles. The Hornet pushed into the wind at full speed, 25 knots, trying to create maximum wind speed across the deck for the bombers to use. Doolittle's B-25, designated No. 1, had exactly 467 feet of flight deck stretched out in front of it. Behind that lead bomber, the other 15 B-25s sat nose to tail at precise intervals, with the tail section of the last plane hanging over the stern of the carrier. White painted lines on the deck marked where each nose wheel and left landing gear had to sit, making sure nothing would clip the carrier's superstructure as the planes roared down the deck. Each bomber carried roughly 1,100 gallons of fuel, every available space packed with tanks. Fuel went in the wings, in the bomb bay, crammed into crew compartments and walkways. This maximum fuel load meant cutting back on bombs. Instead of their usual bomb load, each B-25 carried 4,500 pounds of incendiary bombs. Together, all 16 bombers carried 32,000 pounds of incendiary and demolition bombs aimed at Japanese industrial targets. The flight crews moved through their pre-flight checks while the carrier maneuvered into position. The Pratt & Whitney R2600 engines fired up on all the aircraft, running smooth and steady. Oil temperatures and pressures looked good. Compasses, altimeters, airspeed indicators, everything checked out. Radio gear was tested and confirmed, working for emergency calls if anything went wrong on the long flight to China. At 8:15, Doolittle got the word from the Hornet's Air Operations Center. Time to go. The carrier wound up to maximum speed into the wind. Deck personnel stood ready to pull the wheel chocks and signal the bombers forward. The weather kept getting worse. Wind kept building. Waves got bigger, making the ship pitch and roll. At 8:20, Doolittle pushed the throttles all the way forward on both engines. The manifold pressure climbed to 42 inches. RPM spun up to 2,500. The B-25 started rolling along those white deck lines, the carrier already giving it 25 miles per hour of airspeed just by steaming into the wind. The bomber reached the edge of the flight deck at 8:20 and climbed away into the murky sky, hitting 200 feet of altitude before turning toward Japan, 650 nautical miles away. Behind him, the other 15 bombers launched at 2-minute intervals. By 9:20, all 16 were airborne, all pointed toward their targets, each pilot flying his own course using only a compass and calculations on a chart. Travis Hoover in number 2 kept Doolittle's bomber in sight during the first part of the flight before they split up to find their own targets. Navigation meant nothing but a compass heading and math. No radio beacons, no electronic aids, just dead reckoning. Scattered clouds hung at 1,500 feet. Visibility jumped around between 5 and 15 miles depending on where the rain was. The bombers stayed low, between 50 and 200 feet above the water, trying to slip under any Japanese radar or patrol aircraft. Flying this low burned fuel like nothing else. The engines had to work harder in the denser air, 160 gallons an hour instead of 140 gallons at cruising altitude. Every mile that went by was fuel gone from the tanks. The Japanese had radar sites along their coast, but the Type 1 Mark I units had problems at low altitudes. They could reach out to 60 nautical miles against high-altitude targets, but down low, their range fell apart. Intelligence had catalogued 17 radar sites along eastern Honshu. The bombers were flying low enough to mostly ghost under their sweeping beams. Around 11 o'clock, Doolittle's navigator, Lieutenant Henry Potter, spotted land through a break in the clouds. 20 nautical miles ahead, the Japanese coast materialized. They were south of Tokyo Bay, closer than expected. Potter quickly recalculated they needed to adjust course 15 degrees north to hit the planned attack route through Tokyo. All 16 B-25s crossed the Japanese coastline without triggering any alarm. No Japanese fighters came roaring up to intercept them. That was shocking. The Americans knew Japan had roughly 200 fighter aircraft stationed on the home islands, Nakajima Ki-43s and Mitsubishi A-6Ms, both plenty capable of tearing apart a low-flying bomber. But the Japanese air defense didn't react. The fighters stayed on the ground. Doolittle's plane reached the first target area at 12:30 in the afternoon. Steel mills spread across the landscape south of Tokyo. Chemical plants. Transportation infrastructure. Bombardier Fred Brahma got the primary target centered in the bomb site at 1,500 feet. At 12:32, the bombs fell away, 4,500 pounds of incendiary ordnance raining down from the sky. The bombs hit home. Fires erupted in the industrial buildings below. Secondary explosions bloomed as the departing bomber turned away, petroleum storage igniting in the distance. The anti-aircraft fire was pathetic, just scattered bursts from small-caliber guns that couldn't reach high enough to touch the low-flying attacker. Travis Hoover's number 2 targeted factories and military installations north of Tokyo, hitting them at 1,400 feet. The bombs went down. Impacts erupted on factory buildings and warehouses. Japanese fighters began scrambling from nearby airfields, but they were too late. Hoover was already gone, heading out of the city before they could climb high enough to intercept. Edgar McElroy in number 5 picked the Yokosuka Naval Base south of Tokyo Bay. At 12:45, his bombs came loose at 1,500 feet. Explosions blasted the dock areas. The aircraft carrier Ryuho, sitting in dry dock under construction, took hits to her superstructure and hull plating. Damage that would keep her in the yards until November 1942. Fuel storage tanks exploded. Administrative buildings burned. Ted Lawson flew number 7, the ruptured duck, straight at Tokyo's Eastern Industrial District. At 1,300 feet, his 4 bombs went down, all of them landing in the target zone. Anti-aircraft fire was getting heavier now, angrier, as Japanese defenders figured out what was happening. More bombers meant more organized response. William Farrow in number 16 hit industrial targets around Nagoya, 150 miles southwest of Tokyo. Aircraft engine plants, steel foundries, bombs struck and fires started, flames still burning as the bomber pointed its nose away from the city. Across all 5 target areas, Tokyo, Yokohama, Kobe, Nagoya, Yokosuka, the 16 bombers dropped their entire load of 32,000 pounds of incendiary and demolition bombs. The bombs weren't designed to punch through heavy structures. They were built to burn, to start fires, to consume industrial facilities with flame rather than blast. The Japanese air defense system fell apart under the surprise. Fighter pilots needed 15 minutes just to get organized and climb high enough to matter. By then, most of the bombers had already dropped their loads and were racing away. The anti-aircraft gunners hadn't expected an attack from this direction, at this altitude, at this time of day. Their fire was scattered, mostly wild, missing by whole city blocks. Radio Tokyo went silent at 12:50 in the afternoon. The broadcasters stopped mid-sentence. 30 minutes later, they came back on the air with frantic reports of enemy aircraft over the capital. Air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo and the surrounding cities, the first time they'd ever sounded in actual combat. Civil defense workers scrambled to black out the city, close the blast doors, do everything the manual said, even though the sun was still high in the sky. By 1:15 in the afternoon, it was over. The last bombers cleared Japanese airspace and turned toward China. 45 minutes. That's all it took. The bomb run, the attacks, the race back out to sea. 45 minutes of chaos that nobody in Japan expected. Nobody was ready for. Each bomber had been in the air about 4 hours and 15 minutes from launch to target. Now came the hard part. 1,800 nautical miles to China with fuel gauges already showing critical levels. The bombers had roughly 700 gallons left in their tanks. At low altitude, they were burning 160 gallons per hour. They needed to climb, get up to 8,000 feet or higher, drop that consumption to 140 gallons an hour. But even at the more efficient altitude, the math was brutal. Travis Hoover's number 2 started showing fuel problems as it crossed back over the Japanese coast, heading out over the East China Sea. The Wright R-2600 engine began fluctuating its fuel pressure readings around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Critically low. Hoover's navigator ran the numbers. 4.5 hours of fuel remaining. But 5 hours of flying distance still ahead. The weather wasn't helping either. Headwinds from the northwest were pushing up toward 25 knots. That meant burning more fuel to maintain airspeed, added maybe 40 minutes to the flight time. Cloud cover thickened and rose up to 3,000 feet. No stars visible, no celestial navigation possible. Just compass, compass, and more compass. Doolittle's lead plane maintained absolute radio silence like it was supposed to, but kept scanning the emergency frequencies for distress calls from other bombers. At 3 o'clock, aircraft number 6 transmitted something brief about engine trouble. Something about ditching preparation. Then nothing. Lieutenant Dean Hall Marks and his crew in the bomber, called Green Hornet, never sent another word. At 3:30, that B-25 came down in the East China Sea, about 200 nautical miles from the Chinese coast. The controlled ditching became a crash when the heavy plane hit the water and broke apart under its own weight. Sergeant William Dieter and Corporal Donald Fitzmore drowned in those cold waves. Hallmark, his co-pilot, Robert Messiter, and Sergeant Jacob de Casa lived through it, got picked up by Japanese patrol boats, and became prisoners. Ted Lawson's ruptured duck limped across the Chinese coastline at 4:45 in the afternoon. The fuel gauges were reading empty. Both R-2600 engines were running on fumes in the fuel lines and carburetors. Lawson was desperate to find anywhere to put down. Visibility had collapsed, rain and fog cutting it down to less than a mile. He spotted a beach near Shangchao and made his decision. The ruptured duck came down on sand at 4:50. The plane was doing 90 miles per hour when it hit. The landing gear folded up like paper. The fuselage slid nearly 300 feet through the sand before stopping. Lawson's both legs were crushed, compound fractures that needed surgery right then, or he'd lose them. David Thatcher, the radio man, took injuries but could still move. So could Staff Sergeant Dean Davenport and Lieutenant Charles McClure. Chinese villagers found the wreckage within 2 hours. They came running despite the risk that Japanese might punish them for helping Americans. They carried the injured airman to a medical facility where a doctor named Chen worked with primitive surgical instruments to try and save Lawson's legs. The Chinese medical staff didn't have much. No antibiotics, no proper orthopedic equipment, but they did what they could to stabilize the Americans for eventual evacuation. Captain Edward York's No. 8 ran into the same fuel crisis. As the tanks drained over the northern Pacific, York realized he wasn't going to make it to China. He had to change plans. York calculated that he had just enough fuel left to make it to Soviet territory around Vladivostok, roughly 400 nautical miles away to the northwest. The time was 1700 hours. This decision bent the rules of the mission, but it represented the only realistic chance his crews had to survive. When York's B-25 touched down at Vladivostok airfield at 1830 hours, both fuel tanks were completely bone dry. Soviet soldiers converged on the aircraft immediately. The 5-man crew found themselves detained under the terms of the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact. They were moved to internment camps where they would spend the next 13 months locked away before finally being sent home through official diplomatic negotiations. Meanwhile, the other 13 B-25 bombers were running into increasingly brutal weather as they pushed toward the Chinese coast after nightfall. Finding their way became nearly impossible. Pilots had no landmarks to navigate by, and the radio signals that should have guided them were either dead or jammed by Japanese interference. A few aircraft spotted searchlight beams cutting through the darkness and took fire from Japanese airfields below, but nobody could pinpoint exactly where they were. Lieutenant Robert Gray, in aircraft number 9, tried putting down at what he thought was Chu Chao in the darkness, only to realize too late that Japanese forces held that field. The bomber hit the runway at 2100 hours and immediately drew small arms fire from troops on the ground. Gray shoved the throttles forward to get airborne again, but during the takeoff attempt, the aircraft clipped an embankment. Sergeant Leland Factor died instantly in the impact. The rest of the crew sustained serious injuries. Lieutenant Davy Jones was piloting aircraft number 11 when his fuel ran out completely at 22:30 hours. He was flying over rough, mountainous terrain deep in eastern China. Jones ordered the crew to jump. They bailed out into total darkness with no idea where they were or how to find friendly forces. All 5 men made it down safely under their parachutes, though they came down miles apart across difficult ground. Lieutenant William Bauer and aircraft number 12 also found their fuel gauges hitting empty before reaching any decent landing spot. The crew ejected at 23:15 hours over territory that would later be identified as roughly 50 miles inland from the Chinese coastline. Bauer's crew managed their parachute descents without serious injury and eventually made contact with Chinese guerrilla fighters working in that region. By midnight on April 18th, all 16 B-25 bombers were gone. 15 had been lost to crashes and ditchings across Chinese territory and the coastal waters, while 1 crew sat in Soviet internment. Not a single bomber reached any of the planned recovery airfields at Chu Chao, Chuxian, or Yushan. The combination of the long flight distance, the terrible weather, and fuel starvation had made it impossible. Of the 80 airmen on the mission, 73 walked away from the crashes and emergency landings. 3 men perished during the ditching and crash sequences. 4 others would end up captured by Japanese forces and later executed. The raid had caught the Japanese completely off guard, and the bombs had hit their targets. But every single aircraft was destroyed because of the gamble York had taken by launching early and accepting fuel limitations. Tokyo authorized Operation Seigo on May 15, 1942, exactly 27 days after the raid ended. Field Marshal Shinroku Hata took command of the campaign across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces with explicit orders to hunt down and punish every Chinese civilian who had helped the American airmen. The operation threw 180,000 Japanese troops into action, pulling soldiers from the 13th Army and the 11th Army to sweep through the regions where the B-25s had crashed. The Japanese mobilized 40 infantry battalions and 16 artillery battalions for this punitive operation. They brought in chemical warfare units operating from their Special Technical Research Laboratory. The forces included the 15th, 22nd, 116th, and 133rd Infantry Divisions, each equipped with engineers and signal companies. Every division received authority to wage total war against any civilians suspected of harboring American personnel. The operation kicked off on May 28 with coordinated strikes against 27 cities and towns in Zhejiang province, where downed American airmen had been given medical care and help with transportation. Japanese forces encircled Nanchang, a city of 50,000 people. They began systematically destroying homes and executing residents. The 34th Infantry Regiment alone killed roughly 8,000 people during just the first week of occupation. Chinese military opposition was sparse because the bulk of Chinese forces were tied up fighting communists in the north. The Japanese ran into serious resistance only at Linchuan, where the Chinese 25th Army held the city for 6 days before finally pulling back. During that fighting withdrawal, the Chinese lost 3,000 soldiers killed and another 12,000 wounded against Japanese mechanized units. Beginning June 10, Unit 731 unleashed biological weapons on the civilian population. Colonel Shiro Ishii personally oversaw the distribution of 300 pounds of bacterial cultures, including paratyphoid and anthrax, into water sources and farm areas across the devastated provinces. The bacterial agents got spread through aerial spraying, by poisoning wells and irrigation systems, and by releasing infected insects like plague-carrying fleas. Japanese forces contaminated the water supplies, serving 47 villages with cholera, typhoid, and dysentery pathogens developed at the research facility in Manchuria. They injected bacterial cultures straight into wells and handed out food contaminated with disease to the civilian population. Military medical teams tracked how the diseases spread for research data while refusing any medical help to the suffering Chinese people. Father Wendelin Dunker, a Catholic priest working in Jiangxi province, recorded what the Japanese were doing. His accounts described men, women, and children being executed systematically, regardless of age or connection to the American flyers. Japanese soldiers slaughtered livestock, destroyed crops, and burned down entire villages in the affected areas. Females ranging from 10 years old to 65 were raped before execution. The biological warfare campaign ended up killing Japanese soldiers too when Unit 731 staff neglected proper protective procedures. Starting July 20th, Japanese troops began getting sick from cholera spread through the poisoned water. The disease ripped through the military units in those areas because of poor sanitation and crowded barracks. By August 15th, cholera had killed 1,700 Japanese soldiers. Another 10,000 had to be evacuated due to dysentery, typhoid, and other bacterial infections. The 22nd Infantry Division lost more than a third of its combat strength to disease. They had to bring in replacement troops from Japan just to stay operational. The campaign killed approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians through direct military violence and biological weapons. Another 70,000 Chinese soldiers died in combat or were executed after capture. The damaged area covered roughly 20,000 square miles, spanning both provinces. The Japanese completely destroyed 185 villages and badly damaged 312 more. They demolished transportation infrastructure, including bridges, railway stations, and harbor facilities to prevent future operations by either Chinese or American forces. Farm production stopped across the region after crops were destroyed and irrigation systems were contaminated. Japanese soldiers specifically targeted medical facilities run by Western missionaries since intelligence showed these places had treated wounded American pilots. The Japanese demolished 17 hospitals and medical clinics, executing doctors including Dr. Robert McClure, who had cared for Lieutenant Ted Lawson's injuries. They tortured Chinese medical staff trying to extract information about American personnel before executing them. During the campaign, Japanese forces captured 8 American airmen. 3 were survivors from Lieutenant Dean Hallmark's ditched bomber. The other 5 came from Lieutenant Robert Gray's crew that had tried landing at the Japanese-held airfield. The Americans were transported to military detention facilities in Shanghai, where interrogators worked them for 7 months. They endured solitary cells, starvation rations, and systematic beatings designed to force information about American military capabilities and future operations. Japanese intelligence officers pressed them for details about carrier operations, navigation procedures, and how targets were selected. 3 American prisoners were executed by firing squad on October 15, 1942. A military court had convicted them of intentionally bombing civilian areas. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz faced the execution squad. They were buried in unmarked graves at Kiangwan Military Cemetery. The 5 surviving Americans received life sentences, but they remained imprisoned under brutal conditions. Operation Seigo wrapped up on September 18, 1942, with Japanese forces pulling back to permanent bases in the major cities of both provinces. The campaign had accomplished its goal of punishing Chinese populations for helping American forces, but the biological weapons backfired when disease killed large numbers of Japanese troops and wiped out military units needed elsewhere in the Pacific. The strategic price of this punitive campaign cut deep. Combat units that should have been fighting the Allies got tied up for 4 months. Experienced infantry divisions were decimated by disease caused by their own biological weapons. The operation drained military resources equivalent to a major combat campaign, yet delivered no tactical benefit against Allied forces. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto called an urgent meeting of the combined fleet staff at Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters on April 19, 1942. This was just 18 hours after the first B-25 bombers appeared over Tokyo. Up until that moment, the Naval General Staff had consistently blocked Yamamoto's push for aggressive operations against American carrier forces. They preferred defensive tactics that would consolidate Japan's control over the South Pacific. But the successful bombing of the Japanese homeland changed everything. Opposition to Yamamoto's Midway plan evaporated in the 6 hours following the raid's conclusion. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, representing the Naval General Staff, formally withdrew backing for the Southern Expansion Plan that would have isolated Australia by seizing Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. The General Staff gave the green light for Operation MI, the attack on Midway Atoll that would force a decisive battle with American carriers. On April 20th, 4 Japanese fighter groups received redeployment orders pulling them from frontline combat. The 3rd, 11th, 14th, and 21st Fighter Groups were yanked from operations in the Netherlands, East Indies, Burma, and the Philippines, and sent home to defend Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and other major industrial cities. Each group fielded approximately 40 aircraft, piloted by veterans with over 500 combat flight hours each. The redeployment pulled 164 combat aircraft out of active theaters, where they were engaging the Allies every single day. Starting April 25th, American and British units operating in Burma reported less Japanese air opposition. Reconnaissance missions began encountering minimal fighter presence for the first time since the campaign started. With fewer Japanese fighters in the air, the Allies increased their bombing runs against Japanese supply depots and airfields. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received his operational orders for the Midway assault on April 22nd. With a departure date set for May 27th, sailing from Hashirajima Anchorage, the first air fleet would consist of 4 aircraft carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, carrying a combined total of 272 aircraft composed of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. The carrier force would mount preliminary attacks against Midway's defenses before the invasion fleet arrived. The accelerated schedule compressed normal preparation by 3 full weeks, forcing intensive training and rushed maintenance for all participating units. Pilot instruction emphasized low-altitude bombing methods against heavily fortified targets based on intelligence assessments of Midway's defenses. Navigation training stressed precision approaches for carrier operations at maximum distance from home bases. Japanese intelligence assessed that 3 American aircraft carriers remained in service in the Pacific after the losses at Pearl Harbor and during early 1942. Radio intercepts pointed to USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, all based at Pearl Harbor, conducting regular patrol operations across the Central Pacific. The Midway operation was designed to pull every available American carrier into a decisive battle fought under favorable conditions for the Japanese fleet. Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo received command of the invasion force, consisting of 12 transport ships carrying 5,000 troops from Special Naval Landing Forces. The invasion fleet included 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 6 destroyers providing gun support for the beach assault. The landing was scheduled for June 5 after 2 days of carrier strikes against American positions. Simultaneously, a northern force under Vice Admiral Hosogaya deployed toward the Aleutian Islands with orders to seize Attu and Kiska as a diversionary operation. The Aleutian assault required 2 aircraft carriers, Ryujo and Junyo, plus supporting cruisers and destroyers that might have reinforced the main Midway attack. This diversion cost the Japanese around 100 aircraft they could have used during the critical engagement. Admiral Yamamoto boarded the battleship Yamato on May 27th and took position 300 miles northwest of Midway with the main body fleet, positioned to support the carriers and block American reinforcement. The main body fleet included 3 battleships, 1 light carrier, and escort ships providing backup strength during the operation. Starting May 20th, radio intelligence showed increased American activity at Pearl Harbor. High-priority message traffic suggested preparations for major fleet operations. Japanese crypt analysts couldn't break the American codes, but analyzing message volume and patterns indicated significant fleet movements heading toward the Central Pacific. The traffic suggested American forces were mobilizing in response to Japanese preparations rather than conducting routine patrols. Weather reconnaissance flights from Wake Island through early June reported ideal conditions for carrier operations near Midway. Visibility stretched beyond 10 miles, with scattered clouds sitting at 5,000 feet. Surface winds blew 15 knots from the northeast. Sea conditions featured 3 to 5 foot swells, perfect for recovering aircraft during sustained combat operations. The combined fleet departed Japan on schedule, with Nagumo's carrier force leading the push toward Midway. Submarine patrols set up a defensive perimeter extending 500 miles from the home islands to warn of American carrier movements. Radio monitoring stations tracked American fleet communications while maintaining strict secrecy to hide Japanese intentions. American codebreakers working at Station Hypo and Pearl Harbor had cracked Japanese naval communications back in late April, gaining full intelligence on Operation MI, including unit names, sailing dates, and tactical plans. Admiral Chester Nimitz received complete information about Japanese strategy 18 days before the carrier force reached striking position. This gave him time to position American forces perfectly for the coming engagement. Task Force 16 left Pearl Harbor on May 28th, carrying USS Enterprise and USS Hornet with 158 aircraft between them. Task Force 17 departed on May 30th with USS Yorktown, rapidly patched up from battle damage suffered during the Coral Sea fight. The American carriers took position northeast of Midway on June 3rd, catching the Japanese completely by surprise since they expected minimal resistance until after their opening airstrikes. Combat opened at 0600 hours on June 4th, when American dive bombers from all 3 carriers hit the Japanese carrier force during the critical moment when planes were being refueled and rearmed. In just 6 minutes, bombs tore through the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, igniting aviation fuel and ammunition that consumed all 3 carriers in flames. Hiryu launched a retaliatory strike that badly damaged Yorktown before American attacks sank her later that same day. Japanese losses totaled 4 aircraft carriers sunk, 258 aircraft destroyed, and 357 personnel killed, among them many of Japan's most experienced pilots and air crews. American casualties came to 307 killed, with 1 carrier sunk and significant aircraft losses. Following the destruction of Japan's primary carrier force, the strategic balance in the Pacific shifted decisively toward the United States.